Michael Pollan is a professor out in Berkeley. He is currently teaching at Harvard, which is very exciting to me because I grew up outside of there. Botany of Desire was an amazing book. And he had, and Omnivore's Dilemma and Food Rules, and I know I'm missing some, Cooked. But I think we all are pretty much here because of his most recent book, which is called How to Change Your Mind. And I'll let you do the subtitle.
Please, I can't even remember the whole subtitle.
Yet it may be the only subtitle that's longer than Moody Pitches. But
yeah, you had a long one,
we could
too.
race and see who finishes.
Well, we have the same editor who likes very long subtitles.
Right, she does.
Yeah. What the new science of psychedelics is telling us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. Does anybody have a copy they can check that against?
I bet you've got it right by now, because I bet you've been doing a lot of press for a long time. Can you tell me why you dedicated the book to your dad?
Yeah, I knew it was the last book I could dedicate to my dad. He was dying when I wrote it, and he died last January. And it's funny, it's not funny, but it's poignant that actually a good friend of mine read the book, and I was talking to her about it, and she said something that really surprised me, which is, God, your father's on every page. And I didn't understand what she meant. But I realized later that what had gotten me interested, I started writing about the NYU and Hopkins cancer anxiety studies, was that he had a cancer diagnosis, and he sort of processed it internally to the extent he was processing it, and I could never engage him in a conversation with it, about it, whereas I started interviewing these people, many of whom were terminal, others living in terror of recurrence of their cancer. And they had had these powerfully transformative experiences on psilocybin, and they could talk about death in a way I had never heard it talked about, with a kind of equanimity, detachment, but specificity. And so it was, for me, I realized only in retrospect that it was a way to have the conversation I couldn't have with my dad. So it seemed pretty clear that I did want to dedicate it to him. He never got to read it. He died before that was possible, but yeah.
This book started with the New Yorker piece, and I'm just wondering, when you were doing the New Yorker piece, did you already know you were writing a book, or did you need, because I remember sort of trying to convince you, and I don't feel like you needed much, I'm like, you should write a book, and you're like, yeah, I probably will. Like, at what point, was it before you started the New Yorker piece, or during the process? Like, when did you decide you had enough?
Yeah, so this did start out with an article in the New Yorker called The Trip Treatment, which came out in 2014, I think, in February. It's available online. And it was about halfway through that article that I realized, oh my God, this is a really rich subject. I am only scratching the surface. And I was writing for a publication, too, that wanted a very kind of white coat scientist piece, didn't want anything personal in it, was afraid. Had I even alluded to the fact there was an underground, it wouldn't have gotten published. Right. You know, it had to be like straight ahead science writing.
So wait, if you just did the New Yorker piece, you may not have ever tripped.
Yeah,
because they weren't looking for that.
No, they were so not looking for that. But which was fine, because that was the piece that I wanted to write, and I wanted to write it there. But it was, you know, when I'm coming up with book ideas, I don't have a lot of ideas. It's not like I know even what my next idea is. But what I do is I write a couple articles. And in the course of doing those articles, you realize this subject you've exhausted. You're so sick of it. You can't wait to be done with it. And this subject, you've only scratched the surface. And it's very rich. And I was getting all these inklings. I would talk to some scientist who his partner was a druid, and like, oh, really? That's interesting. And, you know, there was all this, you know what I'm talking about.
I know who you're talking about.
There was a subterranean world here that I knew nothing about. And I realized, wouldn't it be fun to explore it? The decision that I would participate was kind of obvious to me for a couple reasons after I started doing the work. One was, it's what I do as a journalist. I really like writing that way. One of the most influential books I read on my work was a book by George Plimpton called Paper Lion that I read when I was 13 years old. Anybody remember that book at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so he kind of reinvented sports writing. And he decided the way to write about sports was not from the sideline with the kind of cigar chomping, been there, done that attitude of most sports writers, but to get on the field. And he persuaded the Detroit Lions to let him go through summer training and actually start as a quarterback in an exhibition game. Right. A very dangerous thing to do now, and still dangerous then. This is in 1965, I guess, or 67. And he wrote this wonderful book, and I didn't realize at the time, but later, that this book had had a big influence on me, because there's a quality of wonder you get when you're doing something for the first time that you will never be able to get again. And so that a professional quarterback couldn't write a very good book about football necessarily, and a guy who'd never been on the field could never write it, or a woman who'd never been on the field. But someone doing it for the first time had this really special vantage point. And so I've done that in a lot of my work. I mean, when I wrote about the cattle industry, I bought a cow. And when I was writing about architecture, I built a house. And I like putting myself in the story. So it was kind of like almost obligatory that I would trip for this book. I know, it sounds like I was dragged kicking and screaming, but I sort of was.
It's for my art.
It's for my art. I was a very reluctant psychonaut. I was full of fears.
Yeah,
and,
I definitely got that impression reading. I mean, you were worried about your heart,
yeah,
but I imagine you were worried about your head.
When you're my age, you have to talk to your cardiologist before you trip. And he was basically supportive, with the exception of one medicine.
Which was MDMA.
MDMA, yeah.
And maybe that's your next book. No. But okay, so I know I could tell that you were worried about your heart, but were you worried about what you would sort of uncover or dig up? I mean, did you have
I
some
had all the
that
worries that I think most people have, which is, I would make this visit to the psychic basement and find all this scary, horrible stuff. I mean, I think everyone has a fear of some underlying insanity, maybe not. So there was that lurked.
Yeah.
And I had been, as an adolescent, a pretty fragile person in some ways. And it's one of the reasons I didn't have the appropriate age psychedelic experiences. I was too afraid to do it. But I was also profoundly curious. I was talking to people who had had big spiritual experiences that had transformed their outlook, whether it was the people who were dying of cancer or sick with cancer, or the smoking addicts, or the people in the first mystical experience study in 2006. And I had never had a spiritual experience, I didn't think. I really have always thought of myself as somewhat spiritually retarded. And but listening to them, interviewing them, these interviews that made all the difference, I was jealous of these experiences they'd had and really curious whether I was capable of one.
Right.
And so at a certain point, it was like clear, this is what I was going to do. And then it became a matter of finding situations where I felt safe enough with really experienced guides. And although there's one trip I did on my own that was, very positive. So, so it was. I was reluctant, definitely. And frankly, I think that served my purposes as a writer. Had I
right.
just kind of blundered into this with complete confidence, a certain kind of reader wouldn't have been able to connect with the book. I mean, I was writing for people who haven't had this experience, at least a lot of
right.
them. I mean, I've had literally 20 people in this audience tell me today that they sent the book to their father or mother. And so and I always keep in mind, I need to talk to people who aren't convinced.
Right. When you were in Cambridge, you were looking at some primary sources in the Harvard Library. Was there anything that was just particularly blew your mind?
So a couple years ago, I spent a year at Harvard doing research. As you know, Harvard plays a very important part in the history of psychedelics in America. And I had a Radcliffe Fellowship, which is this wonderful gig. They put you up for a year. They give you a very nice office. All you're required to do is have lunch. And
have lunch?
Have lunch. No, 2 days a week with your fellows.
Okay.
And they give you as many undergraduate research assistants as you want, and they pay for them. So I had this guy who was this just dogged researcher who would call me, and he said, I'm in the bowels of Houghton Library, and there's an archive here, and they tell me I'm the first undergraduate ever to come down here. And he'd be so excited. And I was trying to get Leary's, I did get a lot of stuff about Leary that I don't think has been around, about the controversy around him. But there were things I was looking for having to do with his personnel file that they wouldn't let me have. And they basically have a rule that it's 50 years, and I was just coming up on 50 years since his firing, or I was at 50 years of his firing, but they can extend it to 80 at their own discretion.
And they did.
And they did, yeah. So they're not comfortable with this whole area of inquiry. I think they see it as an embarrassing moment. On the other hand, you and I are going to do an event for Harvard next Wednesday, which will represent their kind of dipping their toes back in. And there are so many graduate students in psychiatry, in neuroscience, in psychology.
There's a lot of interested people.
And they all come to my office hours because they've got nowhere else to come. and you know, I think they'll be the last place to really restart research.
I want to talk about Leary for a sec, as long as you're bringing him up. You say, it is one of the many paradoxes of psychedelics that these drugs can sponsor an ego-dissolving experience that in some people quickly leads to massive ego inflation. I know that is a paradox of our community. I think it's something we all sort of struggle with. You know, my husband Jeremy, he's got this song, it's the sicker you are, the stronger the medicine, which is this idea that like really hard-headed people might need, you know, more powerful tools to really dig down. You know, Leary needed like a stronger conversion experience. On the other hand, there are some people who really defend Leary and his ideas and his books. He's complicated and controversial, and you spend a lot of time, you know, looking at primary sources. I mean, what was your, not what did you write in the book? What do you think now today? Like, have you learned anything
about Leary?
else? Yeah. Where are you on Leary?
He's a very complex character, and he's not black or white. That's what makes him interesting to me as a writer. He did things that contributed to the backlash against the research. He basically, as sometimes happens, got over-enthusiastic. I mean, many of the researchers, this is an occupational hazard of studying psychedelics. You do this, and you see these results, and you're like, oh my God, I've figured out, you know, the key to treating this or the key to treating that. And so there is this irrational exuberance that often takes hold. And I see the researchers today just trying to damp it down.
Right,
very
consciously.
carefully, as well they should.
Being very buttoned up, and you spoke to a lot of very buttoned up people.
Oh yeah,
for sure.
no, but you get them out for a drink and you start talking and you realize that they too think that they've found something really important, and they have. In Leary's case, though, he lost interest in science. And he probably was losing interest in science even before he found psychedelics. You know, he was a very well-regarded personality researcher in psychology. He'd come up with one of these scales to measure personality. But he'd done this experiment when he was still at Kaiser. He was the head shrink at Kaiser in Oakland before he ended up at Harvard, to test the effectiveness of psychotherapy. And he came up with this clever design, and 1/3 of people would get psychotherapy, 1/3 of people would not get it, or half and half would not get it. They were just waiting for it. And then he waited a year and evaluated. That's right, it was half and half. And then he evaluated, and he found 1/3 got better, 1/3 stayed the same, 1/3 got worse in both groups.
Right.
And it made him think, is this really working? Is this really worthwhile? So he was losing faith in science.
Yeah.
He has this tremendous psychedelic experience in Cuernavaca in the summer of 1960, where he says he learned more about the human mind in 4 hours by the pool than he had in all his work in graduate school and everything. So I think he was kind of primed to leave science behind. And he didn't think you could do controlled studies of psychedelics. He thought that was a joke. And so his loss of interest in science, I think, in some ways hurt the field. And led to him kind of moving into this new role as an evangelist. But, you know, when I remember having a conversation with Rick Doblin about this, and he said something really interesting in defense of Leary, which is that Leary created the world in which all this research could now have a renaissance.
Right.
in that he turned on so many people, directly and indirectly, that you now have people in charge of some of our leading institutions who are familiar with psychedelics and therefore not as scandalized or freaked out by them. So, that's a positive take on his legacy. Some of the research is interesting. He developed the concept of set and setting, which you've heard a lot about today. I mean, he didn't develop the concept, but he came up with the terms. I think Al Hubbard really invented the concept, who's a kind of, I think, equally significant figure no one's heard of in the history. So to the extent that this book is looking at a science, the spine of this book is science, he has a negative role that he plays. In terms of the culture, you could argue it either way. But I think we pay a lot of attention to him, perhaps too much, because he's a very charismatic figure. He's very compelling, and his story's amazing. But
right, and he hung out with the Beatles also. What? He hung out with the Beatles also, which is
it's amazing
tremendously
who he hung out with anyone worth hanging out with. Yeah, and slept with them usually too. Not the Beatles, but everybody else.
I have a question. You casually out yourself as a pot smoker on page 124, and again on page 223 that I took notes. I know you've written about cannabis before, obviously.
I wrote about cannabis and botany and desire. Yeah. I outed myself there.
Right, so you've already outed yourself. And I appreciate that you continue to out yourself. And I know that you smoke with Paul Stamets. But here's my question. Do you consider cannabis to be a psychedelic?
No.
Really? And why not?
Well, I developed or borrowed a definition of the so-called classic psychedelics, and I kept them at the center of the book. And for the same reason I didn't write about MDMA at any depth, I mean there were a couple of reasons I didn't, or cannabis as psychedelics, is that there's a unified story you can tell about LSD, psilocybin, DMT as molecules that work on a single receptor network,
right,
have similar effects, and have a similar history.
Right.
So to give some unity to the book, I drew those lines around it. I know there are arguments, and there are some ways in which I can see how cannabis is a psychedelic in its effects sometimes, but we know it works on a very different receptor network.
Actually, Michael, this is interesting.
Yes, tell me. Teach me.
You talk about 5-HT2A receptor, which is sort of, if you had to name one receptor, the psychedelic receptor, that would be it. But it turns out that high-dose THC does activate the 5-HT2A receptor, which I learned recently, and I was like, see, it is a psychedelic.
Wow.
I think, Jeremy calls it the people's psychedelic.
So high dose, is there a cascade effect? What is that about?
I cannot say, but I do think that it is heart-opening and mind-opening, and it shifts your perspective, and it also can give you that child's eye, fresh eyes. So to me, it's like a minor psychedelic. It's not a major. It's certainly not a classical psychedelic.
Well, I wrote about it that way in Botany of Desire. I was very struck by the effects of cannabis on time, and that it kind of opens up the present, and it does give you that child's mind.
A little bit. I mean, obviously, it's
where the
not
dumbest
as
things
much.
become absolutely fascinating, and that is similar. So there are some overlaps, definitely. But I was trying to keep this book from sprawling.
Right. No, I know, and
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about whether you
And
should
you know what?
include
I don't
MDMA
like
or not.
cannabis that much.
What?
I don't like cannabis that much.
What? Really?
I know. It's just not.
Okay, that's all right. We're just
Kissing.
gonna move on. It's okay. Okay, skip this one. Skip that. No. I have a hard question for you, and I'm sorry, but I've been asked
that's
to
fine.
ask.
And we're going to give you guys time to ask questions too. And
Softballs, though. No. What do you say to your critics who complain that women researchers weren't adequately represented in this book?
there are a couple people I wish I had given more space to. I count the underground guides among the researchers for my purposes, and 2 of the 3 I worked with were women. There are a couple characters that I interviewed and met who were really compelling. I think they're important figures.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Mary Casamono at Hopkins, who I think has played a really important role. I mean, I think the quality of the guiding has a lot to do with the success of some of these trials, and she as a guide herself and teacher of other guides is really important. And in the end, I wasn't able to spend a lot of time with her on the page. I mean, she does show up in the book. So it is a very male world for the most part, and that's, so am I reflecting that or reinforcing it? I suppose by reflecting it, I'm reinforcing it, and that's unfortunate. I have an issue, though. There are lots of people who were left out of this book who had important roles to play. I mean, I interviewed you, and I didn't quote you. I mean, I interview about 10 people for every one I quote. And part of that, and I tell my students this too, when you read those articles and they're like 50 different people quoted, they all kind of blur together. And so what I try to do is take all the information I can from people, and I don't always put it in their mouths. It's just part of what I've learned, and then focus on a smaller handful of characters. So invariably, you leave people out, and some of them are in my acknowledgments, because I was
Definitely.
aware I was leaving them out. But there's just this principle of selection. So was it driven by sexism? I think it was more driven by the relative roles of people in the way science is structured.
I don't think you're sexist. And I'm speaking for some female colleagues who wanted, I said, does anybody have any questions for you?
No, I'm happy to address that issue. I mean, all of us, well, I shouldn't say all of us, many of us, are acutely aware of that. There are no people of color in the book either, but there are very few people of color in the psychedelic community. And actually, when I went out on tour, that was one of the first questions I got. I was in Boston, and this woman stood up from the Boston Entheogen Network, and she said, how can we get more people of color? Well, she started as a leader of the psychedelic movement.
No pressure, though.
Gulp. How do we get more people of color, and why don't we have more? And I hadn't thought about it really hard, but it's a really interesting question. And I think there are reasons for it, that some of which are historical. But what I told her about that was, part of using psychedelics, and one of the reasons they're a pretty middle class and upper class phenomenon, is that before you surrender to the experience, you must feel very safe in your body. And how many black men certainly feel very safe in their body, and how many black women? And so I kind of get why that would be. There may be other reasons too. It also takes a long time. You need a lot of leisure time to do psychedelics. So there's a whole class and race and gender analysis to be done about this community. But it was sort of beyond the scope of my book. But I've been thinking about it a lot since.
Well, what's good is I think at least we're all cognizant and talking about it now, and that's certainly the first step to making any change. Any psychiatrist will tell you there's pre-contemplation, contemplation, but then you're actually saying, hey, this is a thing, we have to deal with this. So that's where we are now, which is good. And speaking of male-dominated worlds, I want to talk about your son Isaac for a minute. Ooh, segue. You wrote something really great about him, which is how exquisitely sensitive he is, and that you hope he doesn't harden himself.
That was a kind of epiphany on psychedelics, yeah. I spent a lot of time thinking about my son, and my wife, and my parents.
Oh, we'll get to her.
I had a very kind of family constellation experience in several times. And yeah, my son, who, I don't know, I just fall to pieces when I talk about him, so I'm not going to go too far. But he's 26, and one of the nice things about this book is it's the first one of mine he read as soon as he possibly could.
You didn't have to twist his arm or anything, that's good.
You want to, if your dad's tripping, you want to hear about it.
I bet. When you were writing, did you worry about him reading it, and did that enter into
I worried a little more about my mom reading it. I knew my dad was not a big reader. He wasn't going to read it. But it's funny, I did this event where, one of the early events in the book tour last spring, where I was in New York at Barnes & Noble, and I'm talking about my trips, and there's my son, and there's my mother, and This is an interesting moment. But he was great about it. And he's had his own experiences, not that extensive, and was very curious. And actually, after each of my big experiences, my guided trips, he debriefed me as well, and my wife Judith debriefed me, and that was really useful. I mean, I think that that's a kind of integration you do. You do it with your guide, but there are things your people in your family know about you, and they can connect dots that no guide can possibly connect. So it was actually those were really good conversations, and really helpful because the making sense of the experience is very difficult sometimes. Sometimes they're just so contradictory and inchoate, and you're trying to turn it into a narrative, and you're trying to figure out what matters, what should I carry forward from this experience, and so both of them were very helpful that way.
Okay, I have a few more questions. On page 412, you wrote...
Yes, 412.
...that plants are intelligent, I have believed for a long time. And I read that and I was like, what? Wait a minute. Because I know how, with Botany of Desire and the theory. But I also remember that when I interviewed you for the pot book, you and I talked about this a little bit. And I mentioned that, people who make the ayahuasca decoction, sometimes they feel like the plants talk to them and tell them, which ones to pick and what to put in the tea. And I was like, what do you think about that? And you were like, oh, I wouldn't go that far, And here's my question. Would you now?
I would go farther than I did. I mean, since then, I wrote I do believe plants are intelligent. I think a lot of this is nomenclature. How do you define intelligence? But if you define intelligence as the ability to solve problems, not just by instinct or not just by algorithms that are already in place, there's a lot of evidence that plants are intelligent, that they have a problem-solving ability. And I've written, when I say to people sometimes that I didn't think of myself as a spiritual person, they say, well, what about Botany of Desire? You're talking about, plants as being intelligent, having agency, having a perspective. The subtitle of the book is A Plant's Eye View of the World. And I said, well, I didn't see that as spiritual. I saw that as just coevolution. It just looked at from the other side. Coevolution takes two partners, right? And they each act on one another over the course of this coevolution. So it seemed to me just biology with a kind of a shift in perspective. And therefore it was sort of an intellectual conceit. But then when I had this trip you're referring to on page 412, I guess it is, it was in my garden in Connecticut. And I had this very powerful experience of plants being conscious and aware and regarding me. I was regarding them, they were looking back at me. And I had this sensation that consciousness is spread a lot more evenly over the natural world than we think. And that it's a property of everything in nature. And we flatter ourselves by thinking we're the only thinking subject. Now thinking is, these words when you apply them to plants and consciousness too, I'm not talking about self-consciousness, but I felt the ideas in that book, in Botany of Desire, in a way I had only thought them before. And I think this is a property of psychedelics, that it kind of puts flesh on abstractions and gives an emotional power to them. So it was a really amazing experience, and it was very, incredibly positive. None of the plants they were all very well disposed to me. And
no cat calls from the...
No cat calls from the plants. So I don't know, I don't know how to credit that as a journalist, but I do believe that we don't give plants nearly enough credit, that they work on us even as we work on them, that they've evolved to push our buttons in various ways. And one of the things they have evolved to do is change our consciousness. Now, yes, they probably started putting out these chemicals in order to poison predators.
Right.
Or
just disorient them so they wouldn't know where to go back to get more.
But the dose makes the poison, and poisons in lower doses. Caffeine's a great example. I was surprised to learn recently that something like half of plants, flowering plants, have caffeine in their nectar. That's not where you would put a defense chemical. That's where you'd put an attractant. And so what are they doing? they are,
Though they're creating addicts among the insects.
they're creating addicts, but they're also creating better workers, more focused.
Oh, nice. That's
Harder
really
working.
interesting.
No, they're
It's like
creating
nature
a better
as
pollinator.
capitalist.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
really, that's very
and
interesting.
it also makes the pollinator be more faithful to that particular plant. They remember and go back to that plant.
Right, especially if they have a headache.
Yeah.
Speaking
so
of,
what I'm suggesting is that so-called drugs are all over nature, and they're used often by one species to manipulate another.
speaking of capitalism, you describe the LSD research of North America and Europe in the 50s as more cooperative than competitive. Do you still think that's the case?
By and large, I think we're seeing an evolution now. I think now that there's a recognition that there's something really valuable here, you will see, and we're starting to see, for-profit companies get into this space. And I think it's kind of inevitable. Is it regrettable? Well, if the cooperative spirit is damaged by it, I think it'd be regrettable. So, yeah, it's a concern I have, but I also, I think that there's the context of your question is one particular company, I think, and
It is.
okay. Well, we don't have to beat around the bush.
Well, I guess, I'm curious about your take on it. You went to the UK, you interviewed all the players, you have a sense of what's going on. I guess I'm just wondering what you think about it.
So I think that we don't know how to integrate these medicines into our society yet. What is the best way to create the most access and get it through the regulatory process and do everything that needs to be done? Capitalism is a good way to scale things up. That motive plus greed, or it is greed, that motive in large part, is a very powerful force for getting certain kinds of things done and introducing it to the world. Is it the best way? Well, there are other models too. I mean, MAPS is working with a public benefit corporation. You still have, USONA is doing this in a nonprofit way. And I think we're going to try a lot of different things, and we'll see what works. I just wouldn't discount any one way of going about it as right. I think that there's the psychedelic community has roots in the counterculture and has generally a anti-capitalist, or at least critical of capitalism attitude. But, it's interesting that those of us who argue for legalization or decriminalization should realize that what follows that is capitalism, for better or worse. I mean, I'm from California, where we have legalized cannabis, and now there are big businesses coming in, and that's troubling to some people. But if you're going to make this, I just think it's kind of the way of the world.
Just, one of the antidotes, though, is that people can grow their own medicine. They can grow their own cannabis. They can grow their own mushrooms. And
that's right.
And that is subversive and anti-capitalist, but very feasible.
Well, that's why, I said in an interview that the mushroom itself is the best antitrust protection that we have.
Right, there's how can you have intellectual property of a plant?
Well, in breeding, people do patent plants,
right.
And with GMOs, they definitely patent plants. And so you can't prevent that kind of, there's a real argument whether you should be able to patent plants at all, which is a legitimate position. But the fact is that we're dealing with a substance when it comes to psilocybin that will be very hard to control. And there might be people out there saying, I've got this new method of controlling it, I have a proprietary kind of psilocybin, but that's the kind of bullshit you say to investors all the time. The mushroom still grows, and the mushroom will grow. Yes, you can grow them yourself, and you can find them out in nature. So I don't worry about an enclosure of the psilocybin mushroom.
Great. Quote, my peace offering to Judith, to be more and do less. Successful?
Nah. So I did.
Did it for a little while? Was that the case?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways. I mean, I've taken that lesson to heart. I had this big epiphany on 5-MeO-DMT, which was the most unhappy or complicated part of the book. And my guide had said, "What can you bring back? You know, bring a peace offering from this experience." And I had this experience where there was no existence at all. There was just pure energy. It was horrible. And I've talked to 2 people today with a lot of experience of 5-MeO-DMT, and one said I used too much, and one said I didn't use enough.
Great.
So I'm not going near that again, but until you guys figure it out. But anyway, so I had an experience where it wasn't just ego dissolution. It wasn't just non-dual. There was like nothing. It wasn't just it wasn't just no more self. There was no more matter.
It's the void.
It's the void.
It's called the void.
It's the void, but it wasn't a calm void.
It's not a happy place for most people, but sometimes the light after the void. But I think with 5-MeO, sometimes it's just the void. And then you wake up.
It was too fast. I came down too fast, so I didn't get any kind of nice, anyway. But I did emerge from it as I started reconsolidating as a body in space. And I touched my legs and it's like, existence.
Yeah.
You know, most of us have said we're glad to be alive. We've had gratitude for being alive. How many of us had gratitude that anything exists? That there is something rather than nothing. And I felt so great about it. And I realized, God, I don't really pay enough attention to being. I'm so concerned with doing. And being's fantastic. Because now I was being again. That was my, and I think about that a lot, but I'm still pretty busy.
You mentioned gratitude, and you talked about, one of your trips, sort of afterglow. I believe it was page 254, when you said that it left you feeling uncommonly appreciative. And I think that's how we all feel about this book. It's been great for us.
Thank you, Julie. That's very kind. Thank you.
As these people read the book and say, wow, that sounds like something I may want to get involved in. They're not researchers, they're not clinicians. What's the best advice you have for all of those people? Thanks.
So one of the things that's happened that has really hit me hard was how many people have asked for referrals. And a lot of them are really in pain. And I have talked to, people just, my phone number is not hard to find. People just call or they email me or they send me a letter. And, their son's been suicidal for 20 years or they've had an alcohol problem and nothing else has worked, or they've been through every depression therapy. And I had to make a decision at the very beginning that I wouldn't make any referrals because it just was too dangerous. I was really concerned about the guides that I knew, and that some pressure might be put on them or some effort to find them might be generated by the Justice Department or local prosecutors. So I've had to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. But what I did instead was I put a lot of resources on my website that a clever person could use to kind of navigate their way toward possibly some people who would help. For example, I put all the psychedelic societies down, and I know psychedelic societies are places where people talk about medicine rather than use them. But on the other hand, if you take part in that conversation, you're likely to get an introduction. And same with holotropic breathwork sessions. There's a lot of overlap in that community and the guide community. So I tried to give some useful hints. I do feel a sense of responsibility when I hear from people who've decided to have an experience after having read the book, and many people did read the book and that was their first reaction, is that this is an experience I want to have. I'm very concerned about the welfare of my sources and have taken as many pains as I can to protect them. So that's kind of how I've handled it. It's not perfect, but I feel really fortunate that there hasn't been anything negative that's come out of this thus far. But I was struck by how many people are really suffering, and that the demand so far exceeds the supply of care that we have available, whether in trials or in the underground.
I'm wondering if you've been doing anything, or if you've been meditating more as a result of your experiences, or what you're doing to, integrate them personally, and if you're at all tempted to go back to the trough for a booster shot.
I do think that psychedelics are a great way to kickstart a meditation practice, and I could imagine a time when it will be used that way. It's a very logical place to go if you've had a non-dual experience, or have experienced the virtues of being over doing. And it's no accident that so many of the important American Buddhists, this generation that came of age in the 70s and 80s and really introduced Buddhism to America, so many of them began with psychedelics. I've interviewed several of them, and they're pretty out of the closet talking about it now. They weren't always, and there's a lot of logic to it. And in fact, there's a neurological logic to it too. One of the things I talk about in the book is the discovery that the fMRI images of people on psilocybin looked very similar to the fMRI images of people, very experienced meditators, when they were meditating. Judd Brewer had done this work at Yale. And so in both cases, the default mode network, which you've heard a lot about today, is downregulated or quieted. And that's not surprising, because both activities tend to diminish the ego or shrink it to some extent. And although psychedelics don't quiet the mind exactly, so there also are distinctions. So we have to realize that's a pretty crude overlap, but it's real.
That's a good point.
And so I know you're not supposed to judge the quality of your meditation, but I think I'm a better meditator. I'm certainly a more faithful meditator than I was before, and it has made me want to explore deeper. I've never done a silent retreat or anything, but it's made me much more curious about meditation as another modality to explore this transcendence of self, which I really think is at the very center of the experience.
You mentioned that when you spoke with your doctor and got approval before you did this, that he kind of separated out MDMA as the one that he had concerns about. Why was that drug separated out as ones for concern?
It's more than you need to know, but I had a condition called atrial fibrillation, which is an irregular heartbeat, and his understanding, and this is not authoritative science, this is one cardiologist saying, it is an amphetamine and can raise your heart rate, so he just, as a matter of caution. I subsequently learned from Andrew Weil, of all people, I had told him the story, and he said, well, all you have to do is take a beta blocker before, you'll be fine. Is that true?
Probably.
Okay.
It would probably work. I don't think that a beta blocker would necessarily interfere with a sort of psychic or emotional experience very much.
But it would keep your heart rate down.
I prescribe a lot of beta blockers. My patients who take them before they give a presentation.
Yeah, that's a very common use. Because they blunt the adrenaline response?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew somebody who took one before they went to see a horror movie, and they were like totally relaxed the whole time, could just enjoy the movie.
Why bother, though?
The elves, the entities, the alien beings. What do you feel this coincidence of everyone recounting the same story of like alien encounters?
Well, I'm glad you used the word feeling, because that's all it would be, is a feeling. But I haven't encountered the entities. I'm really curious about it. I'm glad people are starting to study it. I think it's very interesting whenever you have people having similar imagery or symbolism on an experience. I think the real test would be to see if you could find a population that had never heard about elves and DMT, and see if it happens cross-culturally. If you really want to see if there's something inherent in the drug. I mean, these are very mysterious drugs in terms of the variety of experiences people have, and how much their expectations influence the experience.
And how much cultural folklore or knowledge influences it.
This is now a trope, the elves, and many people have heard it.
Right.
So you'd also want to trace, like, before Terence McKenna, was the incidence of elf sighting higher or lower? That would be interesting to look
Well,
at.
there are people who think, I mean, first of all, I have to quibble a little bit with your everyone, because not everyone has had the experience of entities. And not everyone sees snakes with ayahuasca, and it's not ever really anyone always, especially when you're talking about psychedelics. There's so much variability.
The variability is really important.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Julie.